Hey everybody, welcome to the Secure Containment Information Facility, otherwise known as the SCIF. Here we're going to talk about things that we otherwise, just for members, and this won't probably go public because we're not going to be getting too spicy today. But
you never know.
If you want the whole backlog,
if anything, we were probably too spicy in the normal episode today,
right.
talking about the Israeli nuclear program.
Doing too much noticing. So today we're going to be talking about Ezra Klein did this interesting interview with this guy who's employed by the Democrats, does all like their public polling, and gets into they're still asking the question, why'd we lose? Right? So
keep asking.
The answers that they come up with, the way they deal with it, I think is insightful for the way the Democrats are conceptualizing themselves as they're kind of lost in the wilderness of losing devastatingly to Trump last time. And they do go into how devastating it was. And it's pretty interesting to watch. So I thought it would be good stop and play.
What was that Hillary Clinton book? Like What Happened or something?
If I did it.
Yeah, that one. Remember when Hillary Clinton was like driving down the freeway? It was like What Happened? Or, like, didn't she? They wrote a book about why she lost the election or something.
Yes, and it was the Russians. That's why. That was the long and short of it.
Yeah.
But okay, so let's jump into it. The first topic, there was a bunch of different topics, but we kind of picked and choose a few here. And the first topic is non-white voters. What happened? So here they are.
Slide over here that just looks at support for the Democratic presidential candidate in 2016, in 2020, and 2024
He sounds like
by
a liberal.
race and ideology. In 2016, Democrats got 81% of Hispanic moderates. And in 2024, Democrats got 58% of Hispanic moderates. That's only about 7% more than the 52% that they got of white moderates. The main story with respect to this is just a continuation of the trends that we saw 4 years ago. Throughout the entire Trump campaign, we've seen this racial depolarization.
The thing I find most surprising here is you look at white voters, liberal, moderate, and conservative. And at least in this data, from 2016 to 2024, there's a 0% swing in any of them. Because there are all these things that, if you go back to the debates we were having about Donald Trump then, it is the return and resurgence of a coalition trying to protect white power in this country. And I wrote things about this. I think there's good reason to believe that.
Right?
Even if that was part of the intention then, that does not appear in the results. The Democrats lose modest amount of support among black voters in those years. They lose a huge amount of support among Hispanic voters and a kind of significant amount among Asian voters. Why do you think that is?
I think that a lot of political analysis in America has been, really centered around viewing everything through a very America-centric lens. Because there's this story in American politics. Like, if you want to understand 20th century American politics, then the big story is that there was this giant Southern realignment in 1964.
Driven by the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, driven by the Civil Rights Act. And that carried forward. It took a really long time, for that to really work its way through down ballot. And so I think it was really tempting for American political scientists and kind of a lot of the, more detail-oriented American political pundits to just kind of see everything.
People who wrote books like Why We're Polarized, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Just to see everything through this transformation. Thomas Piketty.
Maybe pause it there.
Yeah. So racial depolarization, bad for Democrats.
Interesting. What's your take on that, David?
Actually, I want to pull up the graph that they had. Yeah, that's a useful graph.
Yeah.
It's a chart, Kyle. It's a chart.
Sorry, I'm Canadian. It's a different language.
You call chips crisps as well?
Yeah. Yeah, that is a thing that happens, isn't it?
I don't know. I think that's England, but I'm pretty sure
Potatoes
you got a couple of those.
Yeah, like JoJo potatoes or like chips.
Yeah.
Mac and cheese is craft dinner.
Yeah. And I have a different word for flashlights and
napkins.
Torches and cigarettes. We won't talk about that one. So, all right. So,
what are your thoughts?
All right. So, Hispanics. Clinton gets 81% of Hispanics in 2016. Biden gets 70%, and then Harris got 58%. Very interesting moment. Why is that?
Why is that?
Good question. I don't suspect that the racial dynamics that they anchor into, which is the underlying presumption, is that everyone will always forever believe that Republicans are racist and that our accusations of them will stick forever, right? It's just, yeah. Especially when you look at, like, you go back further, Bush does really well amongst Hispanics.
Well, it's like I remember there's a quote from LBJ after signing the Civil Rights Act that he said that he'd have these people voting Democrat for 100 years. Those weren't the exact words he used. He used a little bit more colorful language.
He didn't say people is the key.
Spanish words, if you will.
He used a bit more colorful language on that. But and like that seemed to be true for 60.
Yeah,
it seemed to have worked for, until then. But that programming over the American populace has decreased greatly, especially as I think a lot of these communities, they don't feel like the programs and all the benefits that are coming from the federal government, from the Democrats, are helping them anymore. They don't feel that way anymore, and that kind of like programming that was settled into these communities has been lifted, and you have people rising out of those communities trying to get people out of that kind of collective mindset.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the black vote, even conservative black voters only voted 77% for Kamala Harris, right? But the swing in Hispanics, I think, is interesting, right? Because the culture part of it is real, right? Hispanics are more likely to be rural. They're more likely to have in urban and rural, right? But
religious
they're more
backgrounds too,
widely distributed than the black population is, and the Asian population. And their background is conservative, socially, right? They're more likely to be religious. They're more likely
family oriented,
things
like that.
And then the sensitivity around things like inflation, right? So it's a stereotype to view the Hispanic population as only caring about immigration, as if they're a monolith, and saying that, an open border would be great. Well, that's not true amongst voting populations of Hispanics, because voting population Hispanics are citizens who are worried about, drugs and crime and all that kind of stuff too.
Well, and job replacement probably by migrants who are not on the books, who can do work tax-free, and who employers might be inclined to hire over them.
100%. Yeah, because Latino citizens follow all the same rules everybody else follows, right? Like the problem is the illegal aspect, and they are equally concerned by that.
Yeah,
and I think the Democrat association with those two, just so that they can oppose Trump, has actually driven them further away.
Yeah,
right. Because Bill Clinton was anti-illegal immigration. Barack Obama was anti-illegal immigration. Right? They had strong talking points about those things. Was Kamala Harris strong on illegal immigration in any sense? Well, especially because she couldn't really deviate from being part of the Biden regime, right? So therefore, if she came out and said, we need to do something about the border, they'd be like, well, why aren't you doing something about the border?
She was the border czar.
She was the border czar, exactly.
Can you believe the contrast between Kamala Harris and Tom Homan? Like, can you believe the contrast? It couldn't be more stark.
It is funny too, just like kind of in a broader context, kind of maybe taking it away from this specifically, but there are Democrats that are trying to tackle this problem. Like Gavin Newsom has started his podcast. I listened to his interview with Charlie Kirk, and there was a lot of back and forth there talking about like him trying to get Charlie's opinion as somebody who really galvanized the youth vote for Trump. On where the Democrats are going wrong. And it was interesting to hear like Newsom dance around certain subjects that he knows he can't tackle, but he wants to be able to tackle. Like it's just like everything's just like walking on landmines for them. And he's trying to be like a little bit more moderate than the rest of the Democrats, but he knows that there's tripwires he can't go over. It's fascinating to watch still.
Well, speaking of the youth vote, that's another major variable for the election. And they did discuss in this with some numbers. I think that'd be insightful.
Here we have Harris support by single age year, by race and gender.
I found this chart a little hard to read. So can you describe to me what's happening here?
Sure. So we have
it's a graph,
four lines on the chart.
Thank you, Kyle.
And the x-axis is age, and the y-axis is our estimate for what fraction of people in that group voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. And, we have
let me just pause on this
line
so we can see it.
Yeah, so the bottom is age, and then the top is voting for Kamala Harris. So the higher you are up, the more you voted for Kamala Harris. So you see white women, regardless of age, voted overwhelmingly for Harris. But if you look at young men, very low.
I'm sorry. We're inverting those. The white women is the moderate, around 50%. The one that's highlighted up top, that is people of color women.
Right. Sorry.
It's interesting too, because there was a dynamic, or there was a image, and it might have come from the same report maybe, that's been going around online over the last 2 days, which was showing it was specifically white men and white women, but then dividing them by college. And it was just like white men without college degrees, super high Republican, white men with college degrees, it was like 50-50. And then like white women without college degrees, like relatively high, like not as high as the men, but then like white women with college degrees, just completely Harris, like almost. Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic there to see too. It's just like something about the college system that does this.
To women.
To also
women.
men,
more than men,
more than men, but like, cause like the men, it did drop from like way high Trump to like 50-50, but like it's just notable. And especially when we're talking about young people here, like that's
impressionable.
For women of color, we have a dark blue dash line for men of color. We have like a light pink solid line for white women, and then a dash line for white men. And one of the things you can see here is if you just look at 18-year-olds, 18-year-old women of color are the only of the four that actually, voted that Harris won. Trump narrowly won, non-white men.
So I do find this part of
at
this
18
chart
years old.
shocking. I sometimes talk about narrative violations, and I think if we knew anything about Donald Trump 8 years ago, it's that young people did not like him.
Right.
And Republicans are maybe throwing away young people for generations in order to run up their margins among seniors. But if you look at this chart among white men who were 75 years old, supported Kamala Harris at a significantly higher rate than white men who are 20 years old.
That's exactly right.
That's a real shift.
It is a real shift. This is the thing I am the most shocked by, I think, in the last 4 years, is that young people have gone from being the most progressive generation since the baby boomers, and maybe in some ways more so, to becoming potentially the most conservative, generation that we've experienced, maybe in 50 to 60 years.
That's something I want to echo too, is in crypto, I meet a lot of kind of early 20s kids all the time that are like wicked smart and super based, like all of them. Like they're rejecting the millennials in their entirely. Like the millennials are the problem here when we're talking about it. Like it's like the millennials got programmed through college stuff and like through, and we kind of see that. Like if you read Jonathan Haidt's work, and Greg Lukian of The Coddling of the American Mind, like it's very specifically, everything kind of began at the people who entered college at like 2013, which is actually the year I entered college. And that's when all the free speech stuff starts going on, free speech zones, all this stuff starts going crazy. And then kind of for 10 years. And then you go back and you look at, well, what was their parenting like at the time? And it's like the rise of helicopter parenting and all this stuff.
Allergies, all that kind of stuff.
Peanut allergies on the rise, like massively. And because they're suggesting it's actually much more of a anti-fragility thing, where it's just like kids weren't exposed to peanut allergies, so or to peanuts, and they never because of the scare.
Right, because parents were afraid, if I give him peanuts, he might be allergic, might die.
When really it seems like giving them the peanuts would have been the thing that helped prevent the allergies, right? For in a lot of cases. But so you kind of see that, but then the Gen Z is rejecting all of that right now, which I think also goes into a lot of the TikTok banning stuff, because it's like we've lost control of our kids kind of a thing, but they're the ones rejecting the system in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Who's we that's lost control of the kids?
Yeah. And noting a lot of the Gen Z parents are Gen X
based.
Yeah. So they were raised very different than the baby boomers, which are the millennial parents.
Yeah.
Fair point.
Right. So like a different parental style, that could explain some of it. If we go a little bit further, we'll get into some of the influences that they blame on this, and like the media narrative component of it, because I think that's also insightful for conceptualizing the Gen Z phenomena. Yeah.
All right, let's keep it.
And so, the next chart, just to describe
this chart in some ways convinced me to do this podcast.
Oh, thank you.
This chart shocks me.
I agree. This is, to me, the scariest chart in this entire presentation.
Scary.
And again, something I'm very surprised by. In the bottom, we have age. And at the top, we have the gender gap in support between women and men. And, for support for Kamala Harris. And so what you can see is that, for voters over 30, the gender gap was fairly stable at around 10%, which is roughly where it's been in American politics.
And voters over 75, it's even lower.
That's right.
It's a fairly low gender gap among older voters.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people, underestimate how recent the gender gap is. Historically, Republicans did better with women than men.
I'm only seeing 2 genders on this chart, and that makes no sense to me.
How are the
We need a matrix. This needs to be 4-dimensional.
It is funny how they just really quickly move it to that gender is not a social construct when they're discussing polling.
That's so real. You know what I mean?
That is. Like I listened to the whole thing, didn't note that at all, and then like you just nailed it. It's so
yeah, because I have to imagine a bunch of these poli sci nerds being like, well, we also have to think about the other genders, and then, but then when they come in here, they're just like, get rid of it. We need to figure out how to win. We need to figure out winning.
That's only 1% of the electorate. We're not going to worry about that. Yeah.
Whoa.
All right. We can keep playing.
God, that was so true. That was so good.
This was true across most of the West, that center-left parties did better with men than women. And, that's changed in the United States in the Clinton era. But, it's been stable since then. But what's crazy is if you look at people who are under the age of 30, the gender gap has exploded. If you look at 18-year-olds, 18-year-old men were 23 percentage points more likely to support, Donald Trump than 18-year-old women, which is just completely unprecedented in American politics.
Is that abortion?
I think it's too early to say exactly what the cause is. What's interesting is that this is happening in other countries as well. Obviously, different countries have different political systems, but I've seen similar patterns in Canada, in the UK, in Norway. There's a lot of research, to do here, but it's still very striking. A lot of people talk about
a lot of it too is just like the policies of all these Western countries are just like, let's attack men, right? That's a lot of what's been going on in all these countries. And I feel like there's just a rejection of that that's happening now.
Yeah, it's the cultural thing, but I also think it's also the economics, right? You're more sensitive to inflation. You're more sensitive to competition from newly arrived immigrants, right? So if what you're concerned about, if immigration's high on that list, your sensitivity to that's going to be far greater if you're younger because you have less skills, you're more competitive, you're more in a competition market versus that's a thing that my gardener does.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, with that theory, you would be saying that young men are more sensitive to inflation than young women. Do you think that's the case?
Well, depends. So
explain.
So if young men are on average in your culture more likely to not get support from the parents than young women are into their mid-20s or even earlier, then maybe you would be.
Would you say that's the case in the United States?
I don't know.
That's yeah.
I'm not
just from being in college and talking to people about getting allowances from their parents and stuff like that. Yeah.
Is it more likely to be a girl that's going to get allowance from their parents versus a guy?
Yeah. That's just like my own anecdotal experience,
Yeah.
though, of understanding that.
It could be that, and I think direct competition, especially when we're talking about education level. If you're in low education, then you're more likely to be in direct competition with the people who are being imported.
Yeah,
Grok seems to think that young men are generally less likely to receive prolonged support from their parents through their teens and 20s compared to young women.
Yeah.
I won't dig into the numbers, but seems to corroborate.
That seems like a historical norm too. That just seems to be a thing with societies, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Go out, get a job, support yourself, become a man. That's sort of culturally part of the ethos.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I had another thought on that too, and I've lost it. Oh, I think there's another element there too, which is kind of like on the psyoping end. I'm using psyop loosely, of just when kids started paying attention to politics, I think is becoming much younger and in high school and things like that too, because of social media.
Yeah.
Where I feel like when all of us would have been going into that college age sphere, a lot of people around you never even once thought about politics until they hit college, and then they're instantly getting kind of the indoctrinated establishment narrative that's coming into that, where kids in high school are already kind of young and rebellious, and they're beginning earlier to seek out information because they're curious about things, or things are popping up for them on TikTok and things like that, and it's putting them down rabbit trails that they otherwise wouldn't have in previous generations.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of that's happening.
And it's partially the influence culture, right? So Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, they get into it on this, and we don't have to cover from their perspective, but like to what degree has that activated young men into thinking more strategically about their political interest as a group, right? Saying, okay, so something's broken about relationships, right? For young people, they're grappling with online dating, right? And I don't, the amount of young men around me that are like, this is a hellscape is substantial. And does that have political implications, right? Is that swinging women to be more liberal and men to be more conservative, saying, hey, there's something broken about the dating market, and I'm less interested in adopting an established political opinion at this point because I'm not getting what I want out of my life when it comes to my relationships with the opposite sex.
I think that's a big factor.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, and that's interesting you mentioned college as the point of political awakening for millennials, because that was certainly my point. Freshman year of college was like, oh my gosh, now there's so much information coming at me, I have to develop some kind of worldview on this stuff. It's more relevant, just more, in the milieu of what's being talked about on a college campus versus before that at that time for my generation. But yeah, social media is definitely impacting things. And I think you're exactly right. I think that cues right into the TikTok ban piece of it. We need to control narratives, and we can't control narratives as easily on social media where kids can share whatever they want.
Because remember, a lot of the hype around the TikTok ban in the beginning was, oh my God, young high school kids are reading Osama bin Laden's letter.
Right.
Yeah, and they're coming away with it a different perspective than what was the establishment propaganda around it.
Yeah,
right?
they no longer believe that they hate us for our freedom. Now they're beginning to understand there's more nuance.
Yeah, there's nuances to these things, right? And overall, this is just my impression. Kids are becoming smarter faster. And a lot of people are like, oh, these dumb kids, blah, blah, blah. It's just when I, at least maybe it's just because I interact with young people that are crypto and things like that. So they're more technologically savvy and stuff. So I might have a skewed perspective.
A lot of autists.
A lot of autists. But I'm just seeing kids are just becoming, they're so much more savvy and are coming to ideas instinctually on their own far quicker than I remember happening when I was that age for people.
They do have a section in here about TikTok specifically that indicates that if you got your news primarily from TikTok, you're more likely to be younger and you're more likely to be conservative.
Interesting.
Yeah, which they're like, well, is the Chi-Coms trying to manipulate our elections so we don't ban TikTok? Because obviously that happens under the Biden regime. And then it did pay off because Trump kind of delayed it and then kind of forgot about it, and so now it's not banned.
There's a window that's happening right now. The whole thing is frozen until deals are made out. There's currently on the back end a bunch of deals being made on a bunch of people putting money together to buy it. Mr. Beast is putting money into it and things like that. Yeah, okay. It's
so that's still developing. The last I remember is we're not going to do it. There was a deadline, and then it was a
90-day deadline. We haven't passed 90 days yet. The deals are still being constructed.
I thought that already passed. No. But anyway,
Trump's only been in office for 5 weeks.
Man, it feels like 2 years. But yeah, so I think the TikTok variable is substantial. I think the social media variable is substantial. And there's a bifurcation for that, right? The algorithm is selecting for your demographic, right? So if you're a guy, and they use this example, if you're a guy who's into UFC and you see Dana White walking around with Trump, you're more likely to be like, oh, Trump's not so bad. He's into UFC too. Versus a woman and you're watching... I don't know.
The View?
Be the podcast? No. Oh. Well, for a young woman,
call her daddy.
Yeah. Call him daddy.
Call her daddy.
Call her daddy. Yeah.
Don't try to make sense of it.
Okay. All right. So if you're watching that, you're going to get the Kamala Harris take, right? Yeah. So that's going to be. And then your sensitivity to abortion, I think, is a non-trivial one, right?
But I think the
Democrats did try to run on abortion this time and try to use social media for that.
I think there's another piece of it that and this is anecdotal for me, but women are much more likely to judge politicians, public figures based on their character and how they speak, if they're kind or if they're rude or brash, versus with their policy positions, what they actually do, their actions, like, which is a much more masculine way to judge a public figure. So I think that's a major thing as well. Women would see Kamala as, you know, fun and bubbly and brat and all those things, right? And Trump is this rude, you know, misogynistic kind of, you know, awful guy in their worldview, particularly if you're getting your news from legacy press or from like left-leaning sources like that podcast.
And I think it might even be worse than that. I think for young people, with my limited interaction with them, because I'm almost 40 now. So
what are you talking about? You coach jiu-jitsu for kids. You got to be mining them for data.
Oh, dude, yeah. They called me a shady sheehy a couple times. So
wait, why?
just because it's a word they use. They just like call me.
Yeah, skibbity riz. Yeah,
right. So that the brashness is a virtue for the young man, right? It's like they have so little institutional confidence. They're like, yes, absolutely, burn it down. You know, like, yeah, absolutely, call them a dirty word, because that like fits with their culture and worldview at this point. They're like, the more the better, please, because this is all fake and lame and gay.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
everything is gay or CIA.
Well, and that's the other part of it. Like, as far as the what you were noting on the up top, Kyle. Young people of this generation are growing up with the core indoctrination is not what we had in the 1990s of we're all kind of, you know, colorblind society and all that kind of stuff. When going into college in the early 2000s, you're like, well, you know, that was the established norm. It wasn't until well after I was after college all this woke stuff happened. These guys grew up through the woke stuff, right? And they're coming to age in it, and that's what the man says is that there are 64 genders and, you know, men are bad because historical oppression or something like that. I didn't grow up with that. That's all foreign ideology to me. So when they see that, they're like, well, that's associated with the Democratic Party, and I'm not part of that because they think I'm a bad guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
They say screw you, and they go the opposite way. Absolutely. I'm going to go with the brashest opponent to that, and that's
someone
Trump.
who's looking out for me, my interests.
Yeah,
and
that's culture. Weird, right? Because women typically see themselves as a voting bloc demographic, but men typically don't. Right, and that's always a little bit true because of issues like abortion.
Fair, yeah.
Yeah, I'm also thinking back because kind of going into that route of like the political awakening seems to be happening younger for people, whereas like my political awakening happened much earlier than most people my age, where I was starting to, and I think it was because I was like in the early getting into podcasts, getting into like the YouTube rabbit holes and things like that early on when I was in high school. And I think most people didn't tackle that until they were kind of in college for like my age specifically, when it came to like political content, like using YouTube for educational purposes rather than just, and like reading philosophy books and reading political books and things like that, where then I noticed a shift of like all the young people around me, their views began to really start to conform at a time as they entered college, where all of a sudden I just was getting all of the talking points that you would see from anything on like any news show or anything like that. I like watched their minds warp in their like 18 to 21 range. I watched it happen in real time, where I already had this like pre-knowledge of things before I entered that stage. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like it's just like now I'm seeing these kids, they're getting that pre-knowledge early.
Mm-hmm.
Like kind of like I did when I was growing up, you know?
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
There you go. So, and then the last part, the other clip that I want to dive into is the voters want change. And I think the institutional support question, I think, is especially important for Democrats. And it's hilarious to watch them not learn a damn thing.
I have a couple more slides I want to go through. I talked about this before, but voters cared a lot more about delivering change than preserving institutions. And then we have this other polling question here, which I think is interesting, which is just, asking people to pick between the statements, things could be going better in America, but what we need is a return to basic stability. And the other is things in America are going poorly, and what's needed is a major change.
Let's just pause right there. So in here is like there's a bit of an overglow. Like, so things are going extremely poorly, and we need a shock to the system for whoever becomes president. 53%. So that's a big thing. Over half. But then the next thing is things could be going better. 37%. Yeah. That's still damning on the system.
90%.
Things are going well in America and no real changes are needed. It's 3%.
You got to be a wealthy old person for that to be true. Yeah.
Things are great.
Those are the billionaires that they pulled.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is the total American public. Keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Right.
A shock to the system. And when you have those two things, it's 53-37, which is a lot wider than the election result ended up being.
What really strikes me about this is that sometimes I read polls and the wording is pretty clearly there to make something sound better than the other thing.
Right.
Things could be going better in America, and what is needed is return to basic stability from whoever becomes president. And things in America are going poorly, and what is needed is a major change and a shock to the system from whoever becomes president. I would in some ways say the second there is worded to turn people off a little bit. It sounds disruptive, crisis, a shock, right? It's not just major change. It is
burn it down.
Something beyond that.
Right.
And it dominates. I guess, though, I have a question about this, which is, on the one hand, we see lines like that outpolling the incremental change everywhere. On the other hand, if you look at the new split ticket ratings for who overperformed in the election, very moderate House Democrats did very well.
Totally.
There does seem to me to be a tension between two forms of political wisdom that both have data behind them right now.
Right.
Which is that voters want huge, massive change. Mm-hmm. And like the optimum political strategy is Joe Manchin or Jared Golden or Ruben Gallego, who are actually not, or Susan Collins, who are not people who promise unbelievably shocking change. They are moderates who kind of tack between the parties a little bit and, try to represent a center that wants something a little bit less dramatic than either side is offering. How do you reconcile them?
There's an enormous amount of status quo bias in politics. Campaigning on big policy changes, can be pretty unpopular. But I think, the way to thread the needle, what this is really saying is that voters were very angry about the state of things. And what they wanted tonally was someone who acknowledged that anger. Because, Ruben Gallego did a lot of criticism of the status quo and was able to outperform. And
so people want an angry moderate.
That's right. I think that's exactly right.
Like they want not a...
Like I'm not contending with any of this, right? Is that not the impression?
They're like, yeah, so really they wanted someone who talked a big game, but really didn't actually deliver anything. Yeah.
There's also a thing here is like, I think a lot of the backlash is that the mainline Democratic Party was the major culture and people are feeling like they want something different. So like the optimum strategy for the Democratic Party would be something that is more of a moderate on like the general political sense, probably, because that brings things much more in line with, I think, where people want, like they want all the other stuff gone. So like the moderate Democrats are like kind of the radicals in a sense. Because they're like not the ones being like, yeah, kids should transition at 8 years old.
To me, what this says is voters wanted a radical change from the majority of the Democratic Party, which was not the moderate Democrats. There's like four of them. They mentioned 4 people or 3.
Yeah.
Like they're not the majority of the Democratic Party. They're not crafting the platform. The platform is out to freaking lunch. And they're like, you guys, we're kind of fucked here. Come back to the middle. Come back to some semblance of what we used to be.
Yeah. Because we want moderate, like what people want are moderates like Tulsi Gabbard.
Yes. And what moderate means is a Democrat or a Republican that used to be a Democrat now. That's the definition of moderate.
But all of those people, it's not even just that there's just like 4 left. Well, the reason why there's like 4 left is because they all got purged.
Yeah.
Like this was one of the things that like I brought up the Gavin Newsom podcast where he was talking with Charlie, is that this was a major thing that was brought up in there is like he had asked Charlie, like, who are your favorite Democrats? And he was just like, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK. He was like, like, you guys have a problem where you purge, like, say what you want about the Republicans. Like, there's actually quite a bit of robust debate among the Republicans right now.
For sure.
There's a lot of, like, it's become a big tent where everybody's arguing with each other publicly. Mm-hmm. It's not like internal squabbles. Like, these are public things that are happening on Twitter in real time. And because people don't get banned anymore, which is nice.
It is nice.
Like, that's a nice feature
of
American society right now is people can have conversations, right? But yeah, anyways, I'm rambling.
You're not wrong. So there's those variables. What I think is most interesting here is the way they're playing it forward, right? So what the Democrats fell back into was, one, Donald Trump is scary and dangerous, right? They ran on that again. and he's a Nazi and he's going to change everything, when people are saying we want dramatic change, right? So obviously that failed. And so then Doge comes in and ends USAID, and they go like, wait a minute, we can't end USAID. You know, so they're setting themselves as the defender of institutions, of the status quo, of the opposite of radical change. That's why when you look at things like
the campaign phrase was, we're not going back.
Yeah.
We're going to stay the exact same. That was the thing. Like, I remember on this podcast, us being like, that is a retarded campaign slogan. What does that even mean? Like,
exactly. So there's just a disconnect. They're just not grokking that they are so far from where the base sentiment is. And that's why I think all this stuff is going to fail. They don't care that there's lawsuits to keep them from being able to deport illegal aliens. They're going to deport the illegal aliens, and American people are like, don't care. That judge is shitty.
Yeah.
You know, and behind the scenes, Trump is like appealing it, and they're trying to move it through the process and all that kind of stuff too, which is always de-emphasized by the left and emphasized by the right. But what we're looking at is a sentiment where, and it's a dangerous sentiment, I completely agree, where people are saying, don't care if it's legal, just do it.
Right.
You know, and that is, what do you do when the average American is like, I don't care, just make it happen.
Mm-hmm. You're pretty far off the line there.
well, and it's also, we have this thing too where I think a lot of Americans feel cheated by the emotional manipulation that's happened over the last decade on a lot of issues. Like thinking back towards, you know, put the black square in your bio and then everybody riots and starts burning down cities type of stuff. Like the Americans are kind of done with that type of stuff too, where it's like they had wanted change, but then they realized that they got manipulated by the change that they wanted. Like there's kind of that element that's sitting in the foreground too, or like, you know, it's kind of a bit of a deviation from this topic, but it's just like there's people feel screwed by the people that are promising things.
Well, and I think that really what's happening is maybe people are waking up to the fact that they need to be more specific about the type of change that they want. Right? I mean, you can't just, hope and change is a great campaign slogan for Obama.
But nothing really changed.
But what changed? Right, exactly. And was it a favorable change for the state, for the prosperity of the American people?
Well,
right?
and now we're seeing like what appears to be coordinated assaults on the people that are trying to make change, like Molotov cocktails on Tesla vehicles, right?
Right. Which could not be more misplaced if you were trying to actually like make change happen. Like all you're doing is inflaming a situation that is not looking good
Literally
for you.
inflaming.
Literally inflaming a situation that does not make you look good. It makes you look petulant.
Yeah. Additionally to that, I mean, the motive is so clear, right? The motive is to destroy Elon Musk so that he can't be part of Doge, right? So when you see political activists doing violence like that, it isn't good for your brand.
No.
Right. And it's so, when it's so transparent like that,
right.
They don't have the plausible deniability of like, well, I don't know where Antifa comes from. They're just a decentralized group that doesn't like fascists. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, it's not a group.
I don't know where that pallet of bricks came from.
That was what Biden's position was, right? So that is not, in the internet age, that is not a tenable way to go about it. So the more internet savvy you are, the more aware you are, the more people are going to be like calling that bullshit out.
Yeah.
And you're not going to go anywhere with it.
Yeah.
That's the big thing is like a lot of the political institutions, they still want to devise with the strategy that the internet doesn't exist. Like they're stuck in this thing where like we have to do comms for these are the hard, true comms that always worked. But it's like internet exists now. You can't just, Peter Thiel actually had a comment about this at one point. I remember in an interview last year during the campaign cycle where he was saying like, in the early stages of the internet, there was a lot of this micro-targeting that was going on and you could really control the micro-targeting. But now, like you micro-target to this group, everyone's going to see it if it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Now. And and now everyone sees everything now. Anybody that's paying attention on Twitter, it's like it all gets viral.
Well, there's an arbitrage opportunity for anyone that's what Libs of TikTok was, right? People micro-targeting for the LGBT community and then just subscribing, and then we're gonna be like, look at this crazy shit they're saying, and then you get the arbitrage from that.
Right.
So the economics of the internet has kind of disrupted the entire.
Or it's sort of like when that Kamala's thing was like what we're gonna do for black men and like what we're gonna do from like remember
Yes.
and then we made a joking one. I can't remember exactly, but it was just like that went from the Kamala Harris like campaign account, but it's just like everyone can see this and everyone's like kind of like okay, but like are you not gonna you're gonna reduce taxes on black men, but like what about everyone else? like the micro-targeting thing doesn't work anymore. Like
Yeah, we did one for Kamala's policies for white men.
Yeah.
She
We're
never
great
rolled
at it.
out. She never rolled that one out.
I was really hoping.
It's shocking that they lost the white vote.
Yeah, who would have thought?
That's why.
Who would have thought? No, it really is interesting. There's like been a polar shift where I think the prevailing attitude about conservatives is that they're stodgy and they're stuck in their ways and they're sort of, they're on their track. They're old and they're going their way. But really, you've seen the right evolve in a lot of ways, whereas you've seen the left kind of become this ossified, monolithic, entity that is unwilling to really grapple with the substantive change that they will have to make if they hope to win the electorate back. And at this point, if this is a litmus test, it does not look like they're on a track to do that.
No, the left are the conservatives of the last 2 decades.
Yes.
Like they're conserving that culture.
Right.
Right. And now the right is the liberals to that culture.
But
Like
it's
they're
the
the ones
culture-
trying to change the things.
And it's a culture they're trying to preserve that almost no one appears to want.
Well, and it seems like it was heavily astroturfed and largely funded by psyops and intelligence agencies and things like that. Like the more that comes out, it's just like it doesn't even seem like there was much actually there.
Yeah.
To begin with.
Yeah.
So I kind of see it, if you take the larger view, the zoom way out, and this is the mental model that I think best explains the entire picture of what you're describing, Kyle, is that we enter the progressive era at the turn of the previous century, right, the 1900s, and we pretty much live in the setting of that, right? There's all of that confidence about experts going away, all of that confidence about the American empire and the Cold War into the post-Cold War era disappearing before nationalism. The globalism, the confidence in trade, all that kind of stuff is just eroding away because politics is Newtonian. As you push, if it gets bad, people are going to push back, and that's where we're at right now. Is like they've overplayed their hand. They're beyond the. It's much more difficult to be a progressive Republican and much more difficult to be a conservative Democrat. So because of those, and they're just not grokking that they're at the end of their rope. So they just keep doubling down on the same things that they've done, and that's exactly what you're right, Kyle. That's exactly what Republicans did when they lost to Obama.
What do you? Well, that's interesting. If that's what Republicans did at the end of Obama, then it kind of ushered in the radical change that was Trump.
Yes. So we'll see the opposite.
So we're going to see the opposite in the Democrat Party, which is maybe parallel to what Gavin Newsom is doing, which is seeing this trend playing out and saying, "I'm going to get ahead of this army over here and be the moderate that the Democrats can rally behind once they come to their senses that this track is just going off a cliff."
Yeah, and people think of that only in terms of wokeness, but it's simpler stuff like we just got to return to our talking points on immigration that were mainstream in Democrats 2 seconds ago.
Yeah.
Because they're more interested in fighting Trump in defending institutions than they are on capturing votes. Right. So in order to oppose Trump, they take this crazy position on immigration. In order to oppose Trump, they take this crazy position on gender transition and stuff like that.
Okay. So in your opinion, if their strategy is based around opposing Trump, then what happens when Trump is no longer the candidate? That's
a good question, right? Will they be able to pivot to their moderate play and therefore come across as defender of institutions? Does what happens with Trump in the meantime, right? Does we enter the new golden American era, or does the trade war actually stifle things to such a degree that the tax cuts and deregulations don't really, take a big enough bite to revivify the economy to make people feel like it's growing again, right? That's going to be very tight time frame to make very big strategic decisions.
Well, I guess that ties into my maybe our final question here, which I'd like to hear from both of you on. Like, what do you think the long-term ramification of this is? If we're coming out of the tail end of the progressive era, it's been, around 100 years. Are we entering an era of the opposite of that from a Newtonian political perspective?
Golden age.
Well,
are we entering a 100-year golden age?
Well, I mean, so the empire overextends. It's going bankrupt. We have hundreds and maybe we have almost 1,000 bases all overseas, if you include the ones that we don't know about. There's that is a microcosm of the larger phenomena, right? As the trust institutions degrade, what happens? What goes on to replace them? So the libertarian vision is that we replace that with nothing. We instead invest in the court systems and allow people to negotiate these things through after the fact, right? But that would require 60 votes in the Senate and a very brave, consistent set of votes. When you look at things like cutting government spending, Rand Paul put forward his thing to just cut out U.S. aid and actually reconcile those, spending requests reductions into the budget, and was voted down by half the Republican caucus. So is it going to be a longer time horizon? I would guess so, positive, because you got to replace all 24 of those Republicans.
It's kind of funny. I was listening to the Howard Lutnick interview on All In that came out yesterday, and Lutnick was saying, because Lutnick's actually the guy that came up with the idea for Doge and then brought Elon on board with it.
For clarity, who is Howard Lutnick?
Treasury Secretary.
Thank you.
Or sorry, Commerce Secretary.
Thank you.
It's Assent, that's Treasury. And he was saying that he was explaining that Doge is actually a competition between him and Elon to see who can cut the most. Is that they both committed to each other that they're both going to cut $1 trillion each, and that they're having a competition on to see how fast it can go.
Howard Lutnick said that?
Yeah, Howard Lutnick. Well, he's the one that came up with the idea. He came and presented the idea of Doge with the name to Elon to get him on board.
No shit.
Yeah. Like that's the history there that exists there. But it's just, so it's kind of funny because like right now I'm seeing for like the first time ever in my life, there's actually this like passion to cut things and to clean up the budget and stuff, which is just fascinating to me. Like if you asked me just a few years ago if there was ever going to be any semblance of like, yeah, we're going to have like massive cutting that happens to anything, I'd think you were crazy. Yeah. But so, like now we're there. And if that trend can continue, is like we're just getting started. Like that in itself is fascinating to the idea where you're like, oh, maybe the golden age is possible. Like there's actually like hope. Until now, I never had any semblance of hope ever. Right? Like,
who knew
that? Right? Like that moment, right? Like that's I think a watershed moment.
Well, and there's also just kind of getting back to like the youth and stuff too. Is there were during the Obama administration active attempts by the right and the libertarians and kind of that crowd to build up young people. Like you had Turning Point USA, you had Young Americans for Liberty, and like there was a large network that had formed at that time that brought those people together. I was there. I went to the trainings. Like a lot of these big influencers now, I was in those training rooms with them. And it became a thing of like, hey, we're gonna bring up the young people and make it cool and make it awesome and have and get them involved into positions in politics and things like that. Like the Democrats need that, but they're super corporate with their like young influencer thing. You have the Harry Sissons of the world that are getting like funding from this and that and stuff like that, and like it's still very like corporate and it's very like it's the right wing's version is. There's the centralized aspects, and there's like certain things that are kind of like, there's some interesting things where I'm curious about certain funding of this or that. But like for the most part, a lot of it is actually just like decentralized Twitter space type of stuff, and it's like kind of fun to be a part of, and it's interesting, and they've become big influencers and stuff like that. Like the left needs to build that type of thing now for the new age, and they don't have it.
And the media apparatus to actually amplify it and actually like platform it.
And the rise of podcasts and things like that really helped amplify that and stuff.
Yeah. So there was one more one that I wanted to get into. This is the last second kind of audible play, which is the trust on issues, which I think is really insightful for understanding where the right needs to go as well, and shows kind of where a lot of the dynamic is on the post-election, how we're actually navigating issues going forward.
We measure how important voters find it, and that's what we have in the bottom here. And then we just measure, do you trust Democrats or Republicans more on this issue? And, what you see here is if you look at the top issues that voters care the most about, cost of living, the economy, taxes and government spending, the deficit, foreign policy, healthcare. Other than healthcare, where Democrats have a narrow lead, Republicans have massive trust advantages, 15 points on all of the issues that voters care the most about. And so the story that I would tell in response to your question.
Wait, actually, I saw an interesting one in there.
Yeah.
Look at this. War in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Interesting. Like
low issue prevalence.
Not important, but like the people that do think it's important, it's more on the Republican end.
Yeah.
That's an interesting shift.
You wouldn't guess that by looking online. But yeah, and then the other one, inflation, like high importance, Republicans highly trusted.
Yeah,
that is a huge one.
I'm actually kind of surprised that border security is only like in the 60% range of care, but it's obviously like like that's the number one thing that people trust Republicans on.
Yeah, and also noting this is national, right? So if you're in a state that is relatively unaffected by immigration, that's going to downrank it, right? So I bet in the border states, it's probably way further to the right. Than it is
even just things like civil liberties and privacy. Like I feel like in a lot of people's minds, those at one point were more of a Democrat issue. It's interesting.
And they've lost it. And look at where LGBTQ issues are. Top left.
I don't even see it. Oh, geez.
Oh, jeez.
Right?
Nobody cares about it, but this is their campaign.
This is
their whole campaign. This is like one of their 3 issues, and it's at a thing where only Democrats care about it, but nobody actually cares as a whole.
Everyone trusts the people who do care about it think the Democrats are going to care about
really care about it.
Right. Same thing with climate change. You know, it ranks a little bit higher for people, but still, and swings to the left, but it's just not ranking high in people's terms of priorities.
Interesting.
Now, it's wild to me that even though Biden agreed to forgive student debt is still it's very slightly favored on the Republican side.
It's also just a thing that people don't really care about. Really, what this is showing me that it really goes into the narrative of like Trump just picks the issues and it's just like, well, people care about that. I'm going to take that one. And the Democrats are just like, no, you have to care about this issue, right? Where it's like a different measure of like, I guess the populist instinct is like, hey, what
do people care about?
What are the people caring about? And the Democrats are like, we are going to force you to care about this or you're going to be banned on social media.
Yes.
Like that's the difference.
Oh my gosh.
100%. And so student debt, I think the reason why it sits at 50-50 there is because a substantial amount of the population doesn't have student debt.
Right.
And that the amount of the population that has enormous student debt is relatively small. So for those people, they care a lot about it, but that's a small percentage of the population.
Also interesting, but it is interesting kind of what I was going, the people that are college educated and probably have student debt are more likely to vote for Democrats too.
Yes.
And it's like a 50-50 on who thinks is going to do it correctly.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
But everyone is asked, who's going to handle it.
So what is your theory on what the Republicans should be caring about going forward based on this chart?
Well,
Just
I think
keep caring about the same things?
Inflation.
Yeah.
The economy, right? It ranks higher in terms
Cost
of what
of
people
living.
care about than, where's trade at on this?
International, I just saw it. It's here.
International trade.
Right? It ranks far lower. So to me, that's that. You know what? When we did the little scorecard, like Trump check-in scorecard, highs and lows, that the mistiming of the trade war as being before the tax cuts and the deregulation is, I think, a major error. I think he should have delayed that for year 3.
Yeah.
Right. And run on and do very little on trade, instead focus on everything else with the economy, tackling inflation, tackling the regulatory state, tackling tax cuts first, then you go to those issues, because then you can actually build the policy majority you need for 60 to really do the things on the economy inflation you need to do.
I think the hard part though is, I mean, he doesn't understand the root cause of inflation, and I think we've established this time and time again.
That being said, the people around him, they seem to. Like when I'm listening to interviews with Letnick and Bissent and stuff like that, they directly call out printing of money.
Well, that's good. That is encouraging, because I don't think Trump has demonstrated once that I've heard that he gets it. But it seems to be that like the tariff program is a prerequisite for replacing the revenue that is going to be lost by the tax cuts. So his view is more of a governmental preservation view, as opposed to, I'm going to do first what the people most want and then get the revenue back.
Or do it all at the same time. But I just think it's mistimed, because that's not when I don't think the tariffs are going to bring in that much more money.
Right.
Because the flexibility of the global economy is such that rather than selling to the United States, you sell to China or Brazil or whatever.
Right.
And then second, if you tariff lumber, while you have a housing crisis, housing prices will go up because you haven't changed the alternatives to actually creating lumber. If you tariff lumber, you can't go start cutting it down in the Montana forests.
Right.
Why? Because you got to change the land use policies. And the land use policies are set by the EPA. And the EPA, you're not touching.
No?
Well, they haven't passed a bill. Have you seen a bill?
No.
Exactly. Like, that's what you have to do. You got to pass something through Congress. And that's, I think, just the strategic error.
Well, and that's also to bring up Letnick again and Bissent, just because like those were interesting interviews. It was interesting to hear the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary talking about these things, and also both talking about their opinions on tariffs. They have the same opinions. Is that there's a lot of incentives that need to change at home, and like they're justifying tariffs alongside with changing incentives at home for the increased production of this, that, or the other, and also picking and choosing very specific things in tariffs that can be American manufactured and transitioning the economy to be able to
But I think-
associate with that, right?
I think David is right, though. You have to front run that with regulatory reform in those
That's
ways
what they're
so that
saying,
we
yeah.
can harvest timber domestically.
Yeah, but like that's what like it's very clear in like when I've heard them speak about that is very much in mind. That it's not just like tariffs are going to solve everything instantly. It's also accompanied with there's all these other changes that also have to happen.
Yeah.
Like and they have that in mind.
Yeah, that's just the concern is are they mistiming it at that point, right? And I'm not trying to downrank Trump's view on deregulation. I think he has been. He had good policies on that last administration, but you have to change the code to really change the landscape. And you get things like the REINS Act to try to lock it in the long run. Those things are undermined if you lose your policy majority in the Senate, or if you can't gain more votes out of the Senate in a primary to actually change the demographics of who's voting for this stuff, because they're not interested in it. They think the status quo is working great when it comes to the American ability to produce and create things, because you can't just cut down the lumber. You also got to go start new lumber mills because all of the old ones have shut down because of 50 years of poor forest management.
Yeah.
It is a thing. Like I'm looking at this chart and I'm like, what are the things that the Democrats can grab that people actually care about? And the only thing that's really popping to mind is like maybe because of the Department of Education thing, if it's such a 50-50 right now on things, like that's something that they could maybe take. But I just don't see them being able to capture any of this.
But you look at the trend line across importance and ownership of the issue, and it's really down and to the right. It's like the more important the issues get, the more the Republicans own them.
Yeah.
So even at best, they're grabbing an issue that only half the country really cares about, right?
Well, when it's also just like a lot of these issues around the center, they're kind of like boring buzzwords like poverty. It's like,
Like,
what does that
mean?
even actually mean? Like,
That means give all of Elon's money to the poor.
and firebomb if he doesn't comply. Income inequality, like that's already a Democrat buzzword, really.
But noting things like Medicare, right? So that's why when they're talking about it, I haven't found it. I don't know why they're accusing them. They're saying Elon's going to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And
No one said that.
but I haven't seen that happen, but the left keeps on talking about it. This is why, right? Because look at where poverty's at. Medicaid is for poverty. Medicare, right? Healthcare. Each one of those are all the issues that they can own and then run on to do that. So even though he hasn't done anything, they can just whistle at that dog to try to get it to come home.
It's interesting. Again, going back to those Besant and Letnick interviews, Besant was talking about part of the long-term goal of the sovereign wealth fund idea is to save Social Security with the sovereign wealth fund and kind of like combine the two.
Yeah, that'll work.
It's kind of interesting,
Right.
Which is
We'll see. He
silly.
said that's a very long-term view, but there's the political realities in between that. Like, and that's the important thing is a lot of these guys are like there are long-term views, but there's also political realities. Like, and they very much distinguish the two, right?
Right.
Which is important, I think, in my mind, to see that those are part of it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One last thing I want to note is how high national security / foreign policy ranks as separated from war in the Middle East and war in Ukraine. It's kind of in the cluster in the bottom right there.
Yeah.
And that is interesting to me because you have this opportunity for Trump to put himself off as the peace candidate and all kind of stuff. So once again, focus less on trade, focus more on getting your peace deals done now, right?
Yeah.
And that's that was another part of my note.
Also, just government deficit debt. Like
Yeah.
there's Doge right there.
That
right?
ranks fairly high, right? I mean, that's above 50%.
People really care about it, and everybody that cares about it all think it's a Republican issue, in Republican importance.
And taxes and government spending all roped in to that government deficit piece.
It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
Like there's just a lot of that.
Yep.
But
All
anyways,
right.
yeah.
Well, guys, thank you for another fantastic episode of the SCIF. Thank you for bringing this video. Thank you for
times.
your scintillating insights and conversation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the show. We really, really appreciate it. If you know anybody who you think might enjoy this video, it will be coming out publicly in just a little bit. If you'd like to know when that happens, join the Discord. We'll let everybody know. But in the meantime, we appreciate you. Have an excellent weekend, and we will see you in the next one.